Thank you, Sam. Have you ever given anybody a constructive criticism, something you thought would be helpful to them, and you meant well, but the response was so negative that the person felt criticized that you could relate all too well to this Hagar the Horrible strip, where this fellow has got all these arrows coming at him, and he says, some people just can't take criticism. How many of you have been there, done that? Sadly, what happens to a lot of folks is they try to give constructive feedback, and it's not appreciated by others, and so after a while, they just decide, I'm just not going to give constructive criticism anymore. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. In fact, you may have had a mother like mine. When I grew up, my mom used to say, now, son, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything at all. You guys heard that before? You know, if you interpret that to mean don't ever give anybody reasonable feedback, don't ever really tell somebody what you really feel because, you know, they might get their feelings hurt, they might respond negatively. Honestly, that's unhealthy. In fact, it's even unbiblical. Because the Bible does tell us to speak the truth in love, does it not? And if you're going to have authentic relationships, by the way, this lesson tonight is not just on marriage. It certainly applies to marriage. But it applies to all of our interpersonal relationships, especially in the family of God. So the question comes up oftentimes, so is criticism always a bane? Or can it be a blessing? I think this subject is so important that I often tell folks, you're never going to grow if you don't allow yourself to be really open to feedback. In fact, good feedback is the breakfast of champions. And we all want to be champions in our interpersonal relationships. And so we need to understand what's involved in this very important and sadly often neglected subject. Here's a question. Are you still married but emotionally divorced? You know, all divorces, the actual physical divorce, it comes about because at home, there was an emotional divorce. You didn't want to be married anymore. And so you decide to go ahead and make that decision permanent. In fact, I brought a book with me tonight. It's really one of my all-time favorites. It's by Dr. John Lewis Lund, and it's entitled Avoid Legal Divorce by Avoiding Emotional Divorce. I was a marriage and family professor for a number of years. I've done a lot of marriage and family counseling. And this book was extremely helpful to me. I mean, this is what Dr. Lewis Lund looked at. He said, you know, you go to the wedding and you can just see the bride and the groom just lost in each other's eyes, just so excited and looking forward to what they think is going to be marital bliss. And everybody rejoices with them at the wedding. So close, go off on their honeymoon. And then a year or two later, they can't stand to be in the same room together and suffer a very acrimonious divorce. Glad to be free of this person once and for all. How do you do that? How do you go from being so close and really be one to being totally separate? Going from being best friends to maybe in some cases even enemies. And so he said, there must be something going on that severs the emotional bonds. And if I can figure out what it is that severs emotional bonds in a relationship and help couples to avoid doing that, then they'll maintain their closeness and they won't want to get divorced because they haven't allowed themselves to become emotionally divorced. They've kept those close bonds together. And so the whole book is about that. But one of the things he said that just really made an impression on me was the number one cause that causes emotional bonds to be severed, not the only cause, but the number one cause, is when you wake up one day and realize that your spouse has become your biggest critic. Chronic, caustic criticism will sever those emotional bonds more quickly and completely than about anything else. He went on to say that the day that your spouse has gone from being your biggest fan to being your biggest critic is the day that the bloom of romance is off the rose. Boy, that's really true, isn't it? And I began to realize that this idea of how we give and receive criticism is a biblical topic, even though the words constructive criticism aren't found in the New Testament or the Old. But the idea is certainly there. And I couldn't ever remember hearing a lesson on this. And yet it is so critical to successful interpersonal relationships. So that's what I thought when I talked with David about having a session on marriage and family that glorifies God. I would start off with this lesson. It's one of my favorites, and it's very practical. How do you give and receive criticism? We're going to look first at some biblical instructions about this important subject. Secondly, when it's time to give somebody some constructive criticism or feedback or admonition, how do you do that so you don't wind up like Hagar the Horrible? And very importantly, if you're on the receiving end of criticism, how should we decide, as a matter of spiritual discipline, how are we going to respond to our critics? So, we're going to begin with Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. Notice what Jesus says here, very familiar text. He says, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own? What he's saying here is that the tendency when we have a problem with other people, and this is certainly true when marriages begin to fall apart, is both party wants to blame the other. You ever notice that? Now, there are some times where one party is a victim and the other party just went off the rails. That happens on occasion. But most of the time, if you're going to solve a relationship problem, you don't want to just focus on trying to get the other person to change. You want to look in the mirror and figure out, what can I do to improve this relationship? Especially if you've got a lot of things that really need to be changed and all you're doing is focusing in on the relatively minor things that your spouse has to change. Or how can you say to your brother or son, let me take the speck out of your own eye and behold the log, speck out of your eye, and behold the log is in your own eye. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly enough to take the speck out of your wife's eye. Now, obviously, the text here is just talking about brothers. But you can take family members and you can insert them in here, and the same principle applies, doesn't it? You know, I had to get a chuckle years ago. I saw a comic strip about this fella who went to a marriage counselor, and the marriage counselor says, so, what can I do for you? What brings you into my office today? And he says, I'm here to confess my wife's faults. Well, at least he was honest about his agenda. A lot of people, that's what they're interested in doing when they go to the counseling office. They're all focused in on, I'm going to tell you how my spouse needs to be fixed. Jesus says, please don't do that. Focus first on things you can choose to change to make things better. And then talk about the things that you want to suggest that your spouse does to change. Jesus' advice here is look to self rather than to change the other person. But the whole answer is not to deal with oneself alone. he does talk here about the importance of getting the speck out of your brother's eye. Now, if you've got a speck in your eye, and we've all had that happen to us, and someone comes along and helps you get the speck out, are they your friend or are they your enemy? Well, obviously, they're trying to help you. They're your friend. And if somebody helps me get a speck out of my eye, well, thank you. I needed that. Now, a speck is not a big deal, but it is something that's worth dealing with if you're having trouble with it. And so there is a place and time to talk to this other person about this problem, about this speck that Jesus is referring to. Proverbs 27 and verse 6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are profuse." In other words, if you've got a real good friend, they're going to tell you what you need to hear, not just what you want to hear. None of us appreciate a flatterer. But we do appreciate somebody who tells it like it is, but does so with a breath of kindness. And consider Romans 15:14. We're commanded here to admonish one another. In fact, the exact verse says it takes courage to do what Paul said here. He says, be filled with goodness. In other words, you have the right motives. And knowledge means you got the facts. Able to admonish one another. Now, what does it mean to give someone an admonition? It means to warn or instruct in a way that will build the person up, especially spiritually. And so, when we follow this command, and we make sure we have the right heart, and we've got the facts, we're supposed to admonish someone if they need an admonishment as they are trying to successfully run the Christian race. Truth of the matter is, silence may be golden, but sometimes it's just plain yellow. Sometimes we don't speak up when we really should. And if you're going to really have iron sharpeneth iron, close relationships, we need to be honest with one another, with our brethren and with each other in our marriages. There's lots of proverbs about this. You know, Solomon chose to live with 1,000 women. I never understand how that fits with him being the wisest man that ever lived. But I think it had something to do with political entanglements and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, you can imagine what it was like to live in that royal house. And so he has a lot of things to say about this. He says in Proverbs 12 and verse 1, "He that hates reproof is stupid." The American Standard Version says is brutish. In other words, you're like an animal that won't deal with appropriate training or feedback. He says, don't do that. You're a human being. You've got to make moral choices. And the only way you can make wise choices is to make sure you have all the facts. Proverbs 12:15, "He that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. But the way of a fool is right in his own eyes." You ever known anybody to say, nobody's going to tell me what to do? Solomon says a person with that kind of spirit is a fool. We all need to be open to other people's feedback. Proverbs 23 and verse 12, "Don't refuse to accept criticism. Get all the help you can." Proverbs 13:18, "If you refuse criticism, you will end in disgrace." And Proverbs 25:12, "He that wears a badge of honor accepts reproof." And it's not just in the Old Testament. Again, Ephesians 4 and verse 15 says, "Speak the truth in love." So you have to be honest with your spouse. If they're doing something that is hurting your feelings, or they're not meeting your needs in some way, you need to articulate that. And the other party may, have their feelings hurt a little bit, but you've got to deal with the facts in order for you to respond appropriately. All of us need help to grow. We're all imperfect. That's true of every relationship. Husbands need the help of wives in order to be better husbands. Parents need the help of children in order to be better parents, and vice versa. I like to tell people that my wife and I don't have it all together, but together we have it all. And you're just two imperfect human beings, both in need of grace, helping each other get to heaven, right? And keeping that in mind is just so important. Proverbs 16, verse 2, Solomon says, all the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but Jehovah weigheth the spirits. You know, it's really difficult for us to be objective about our own behavior. David wrote a very excellent book recently that he shared with me. And David, I imagine that you had somebody else proofread your final draft. Because most people, at least when I put out a bulletin or anything, it's like I can't see my own mistakes. That's why usually you need another set of eyeballs to look at something. And then once they point out that word's misspelled or this isn't correct grammatically, once they point it out, then you go, oh yeah, of course, and then you see it. But we need somebody else oftentimes to give us perspective that we do not have ourselves. So we all have blind spots, and understanding that means that we actually ought to seek out appropriate feedback. So what's the problem here in getting feedback or criticism from other people? The problem is not criticism, but destructive criticism. If you feel like that somebody's just nitpicking at you because, you know, they're kind of out to get you, well, that's destructive. But we need to think about how can we give feedback to build somebody up rather than to have them feel like we're just going to tear them down. In your notebook that's been put together, on page 6, you're going to find the criticism pledge. If you'll turn to page 6, you'll see that pledge. I love to do this with my premarital counseling folks. And it's also helpful for anyone, regardless of how long they've been married. But it's really a special thing that couples need to think about doing for one another. I promise as your mate that I will never speak ill of you to friend, family, or stranger. I will not embarrass or belittle you in front of others, nor will I be critical of you in your absence. I will not discuss our personal problems with anyone without your permission. This is my pledge to you. Now, what that means is that if women are together talking about their husbands, and they may be saying some things that are not very complimentary, my name is safe. I don't have to worry about Gail sharing some things that these ladies might find funny or put me down in any way. And if men are together talking about women and saying, oh, women, you can't live with them, can't live without them, you know how that conversation sometimes goes. I am never going to be found saying anything critical about my wife. Not unless I have her permission, and there's some good reason to do so. Now, the fact that my name is safe is not because there isn't some things that Gail could say. I've got lots of flaws, and some of them these ladies may even find kind of humorous. Some blunders and things that I've said or done. But we don't do that for one another because of this pledge. We have a sense of loyalty to each other. And that is so important. One of the problems that frequently comes up when a couple starts having a long-term issue of some kind in their marriage, it could be the husband, but usually the wife winds up getting on the phone and talking to her mother and giving her side of the story. Sometimes she'll talk to her sisters if she has siblings, or maybe to some of her friends. And then they all get all up in arms and, of course, take her side. They've only heard one side of the story anyway. And then later on, it comes out that all these different people know about this problem. Maybe something that's kind of personal and embarrassing to the husband. And there is this deep sense of betrayal. The husband feels like he's been talked about behind his back, and he has. So if you really got to talk to your mom about a problem, just say, honey, I want to talk to my mother about that. Is that okay with you? Get permission first. treat your spouse the way you would want to be treated. That's the golden rule. You don't want to be talked about behind your back. You don't want your personal problems talked about with other people without your permission. And so this is really critical, and it solves a lot of issues. And I've been counseling with couples, and it's amazing how this sense of betrayal becomes the real issue rather than the original problem. So you just need to decide, we're not going to do that to one another as a matter of personal loyalty. Okay, so how do you criticize constructively? Well, since some people have a hard time taking criticism very well, especially if they're caught off guard, you need to do it in a way that you're pretty sure that when you bring this up, that the person is emotionally ready to accept it. Well, how do you determine when they're emotionally ready to accept it? Well, this isn't very profound, but I think the answer is just simply you get their permission first. You ask them. You know, honey, I've got something I've been thinking about that I think might be helpful to you in your parenting. No big deal, but I want to talk about it with you. When's a good time for us to talk about it? Is this a good time? I remember one time I was talking with Gail, and Gail looks at her watch. I don't know why she does that. I guess she's afraid I'm going to preach her a sermon or something. But she looks at her watch and she says, I've kind of got this planned and I want to clean up the kitchen. I go, okay, whenever you're ready, you just let me know. So I go down the hall to my study, and about an hour later, she comes down the hall. I can hear her steps, and she opens the door and she says, okay, about that suggestion you had about how I could be a better mom, I'd like to hear it. Isn't curiosity a wonderful thing? I mean, she's been thinking about it, wondering what I'm going to say, and so she comes down, and now she says, tell me about it. Now it's my turn. Oh, it's okay. I'm kind of busy doing this right now. It can wait. She goes, no, I'm ready. I want to hear it. Tell me now. Listen, folks, she's begging for it. She wants to hear what I've got to say. Now, what's better? Suddenly blurting out, you know what your problem is? And have the person tend to be defensive? Or care enough to say, this is something that may be hurtful. I want to help, not hurt. So I'm going to ask your permission as to when's a good time for us to talk about this. And then when they're ready, you talk about it. And in that context, you're much more likely to have a more open heart and spirit, and it's less likely to turn out very negative. Let me ask you something. How many of you would like to live in a home where you only give the family members affirmation and compliments and approval and love unless something needs to be said, and when that happens, the other person says, I want to get your permission and set up a time to talk about this. Time that's good for you. How many of you like to live in a home where you never get criticized unexpectedly and somebody cares enough to ask your permission first? How many like that? I want to tell you, that's a great, great situation. We didn't used to have that the first 10 years of our marriage. And after I learned these principles, we all got together as a family and decided that's what the Hunter family's going to do. Made a huge difference. Do you know that studies in marriage and family have found that children that grow up to be juvenile delinquents report that growing up, they had 5 times more criticism than a more functional home where people grow up, have happy childhoods? They were just criticized all the time. So no wonder they grow up as unhappy adults and wind up vandalizing things. They're angry. They've been overly criticized. I cannot overemphasize how important it is that you feel a sense of love and loyalty and acceptance at home, but it's not blind. There's a level of transparency where you trust one another to talk about important things when they need to be talked about. Because those convinced against their will are of the same opinion still. Now, once you get permission, please make sure you're careful not to give an overdose. You know, if you say, honey, I've got something I need to tell you about, and you go, okay, Let's, after dinner go for a walk and talk about it. It's a good idea to do that when you're not hungry, but when you've just had a meal. And all of a sudden, the other person just says, well, there's this, and there's this, and there's this. Or to put it another way, you just pour it on. Add another thing, add another thing, add another thing. If you just lamb-blast your spouse with all this list of things that have been piling up, you may never get permission again because it turned out so negatively. If my wife gives me 5 things that she's upset with me about, that she wants me to change, I feel like saying, honey, I'm a human being, not an octopus. I can't handle 5 things very well all at once. I feel kind of overwhelmed, and I feel like there's no pleasing this woman. And you just kind of shut down. But if instead she says, now, Brent, I know you want to be a good husband, and you are, and I know you love me, and I appreciate it. You work hard to be a good dad. But you know what? When you shave and leave the whiskers behind for me to clean up, I feel like you're one of the kids. And it grosses me out, and I don't want you to do that anymore. See, she's affirmed me. I got this atmosphere of affirmation, but she says, there's this thing over here, this annoying habit. Please stop it. I can handle that. And I can say, yeah, you're right. I look at that from your perspective. I can see it's not fair for you to have to clean up after me. So I'm going to work hard on making sure that I clean up after myself after I shave. Thank you. I really appreciate it. You're welcome, honey. And give her a kiss. We resolved something that was bothering her without harming the relationship. And isn't that what you want? By the way, that wasn't hypothetical. That actually happened. So, again, here's Hagar the Horrible again. You know what your trouble is? What? Better sit down and get comfortable. You want this topically indexed or put in alphabetical order? And you're thinking, oh no. So, make sure you limit your criticism to 1 at a time, because overdosing destroys the motivation to change. And so treat each other the way you would want to be treated. Be careful not to let things pile up, and to just talk about one thing at a time in an atmosphere of affirmation. In fact, I suggest only 1 criticism a week. Proverbs 17:9, he that harpeth on a matter separateth chief friends. After you've been married for a while and you're adapted to one another, maybe change it to once a month. My wife and I have gone many, many months at times where we haven't had a need to say anything critical because we got things worked out. But we know that if there's something going on that we need to talk about, we are committed to talk about difficult subjects, because that's a part of being one. Years ago, these principles were being talked about at a marriage seminar, and there was this fellow over here in the front, and he saw this point about once a week, and he goes, once a week? Once a week? And I said, that's 52 times a year. That ought to be enough. And his wife's over there going like this, But he thought once a week was like almost impossible. He couldn't hardly imagine. I'm glad I'm not living in that home where there's just chronic, constant criticism. So we must be willing to listen carefully and increase our awareness, because most of us are more critical than we realize. And so there's a solution to that, and that is engage yourself in an exercise where you can catch yourself when you're being critical or negative, and you can help increase your awareness. And so I recommend this 24-hour criticism fast. For a period of 24 hours, you refrain from criticizing yourself. Sometimes that's the most difficult thing to stop. There are a lot of people, their self-talk is so negative. Every time they make a mistake, they beat themselves up. How could I be so stupid? How could I be so dumb? I can guarantee you, if someone is really constantly putting themselves down, they also are putting others down. So train yourself to be your own best friend. You know, I messed up here. I shouldn't have. I'm going to do better next time. Thank you, Lord. I'm saved by grace. And move on. Instead of beating yourself up. It is so important. So if you criticize yourself, you have to start over on this 24-hour fast. The government, the government, the food, your boss, your coworkers, your spouse, your surroundings come to a complete halt for 24 hours. Now, I'm allowing you to include the 8 hours that you sleep. Hopefully, you don't have hypercritical dreams. So hopefully, that's a giveaway. So the 24 hours includes your sleeping time. Now, you can't criticize anyone for any reason unless human life is in danger. Another exception would be someone on the criticism fast criticizing without realizing it. So you can point it out to those of you that are here tonight if you catch somebody here within the next 24 hours being critical. So, if you find yourself being critical, make a note of the time, or someone points out that you were critical, start your fast over again until you've gone the full 24 hours without being critical at all. Most people find this takes at least a week. They have to start over that many times because we live in a very negative society. Just turn on the news. Our culture is filled with sensationalism and negativity. You know, one of the best ways you can improve your mood is just go for a week without listening to the news. Seriously. So much of it is designed to upset people. Dwell on things that are good and pure and holy and right instead. But at any rate, this is really a helpful and fun exercise. And so, how many of you are willing to commit to a 24-hour fast? Let's assume we're going to start at, say, 8:30 tonight to 8:30 tomorrow night. Okay, that 24-hour period. Let me see your hands. Come on, the ones that are most hesitant are the ones that usually need it the most. Come on, sir, raise your hand. Everybody, trust me. You know, when I first threw this out when I was at Tampa, I used to preach at the North Street Church. Somebody met me at the door and they said, that criticism fest, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I said, sir, do you realize you're criticizing the criticism fest? Do you think maybe that ought to cause you to think this through a little bit? Maybe it's not so stupid after all. So it really is interesting how people tend to respond in a very funny kind of negative way to this. And I hope that will not be the case here. It is fun and insightful, and not as easy as it sounds. When I used to be on the administrative team at Florida College, there was a lady by the name of Pam who had heard this lesson and decided she was going to start her criticism fast at 9 a.m. when she went to work in the bookstore. She calls me up at noon. She said, Brother Brent, I've been on the criticism fast for 3 hours. I said, good for you, Pam. How's it going? She goes, well, not so good. I go, why not so good? She goes, well, I've been here 3 hours and I've been so careful not to be critical, and people keep on coming up to me and asking me if I'm sick. They want to know if I'm feeling okay because I'm so different, being so positive versus being negative. And I said, oh, that is really bad. And she goes, oh, Brother Brent, you've got to start over. And I had to start over. I mean, it's kind of fun, but it's amazing how these things come up. There was one time this was thrown out, and this couple was there, and the woman jumps up and says, I'll have no trouble, but he'll never make it. And the husband goes, will you stop picking on me? You are so negative. And I had to tell them, both of you have to start over. You didn't make it 15 seconds into the fast without criticizing the other party. And so much of our criticism, we're not even aware of it. So I'm not saying you live this way all the time. I'm saying you need to be aware of when you tend to be critical so you can stop yourself and only do one at a time and no more than one a week, and only when you ask permission. It's just a discipline. What a difference it makes. Why should you try? It will increase your awareness of the critical nature of our society. It will help you become aware of your own compulsion to criticize. It will enable you to experience the power of self-mastery. And most importantly, this will lay a foundation for love and acceptance in your home instead of rejection. Like I said, you only give each other affirmations unless you ask permission to do something that is perceived as constructive criticism. All right, so here's the ultimate challenge. This isn't easy. Ask for it. When I first understood these principles from Dr. Lund, I had a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old at home. Amy was 12, Allison was 10. And every night I would go in as the dad and I would say prayers with them before they went to bed at night. And so this time I decided, okay, Amy, I want to be the best dad I can possibly be. I just want you to tell me honestly, is there anything I can do that would help me to be a better dad? She says, yeah, I can think of something, Dad. I go, oh. Kind of swallowed hard. She said, triple my allowance. And I said, I don't think that's in your best interest, Amy, but thanks for letting me know how you feel. Then I went to Allison. I said, how can I be a better dad, Allison? What do you think? Let's pray about it. She said, oh, Dad, you're doing fine. I think, thank you, Allison, but if there's anything that comes up, I want to keep this close rapport, and I want to keep our communication lines open. So 2 or 3 days later, I was saying prayers with Allison, and Allison goes, Dad, you know, Mom and I were talking. Not good. She goes, Mom and I were talking, and we think that sometimes you tend to be defensive. I said, really? Okay, can you give me some examples? And she gave me some examples, and I thought she had a point. And I said, you know, let's pray together about that, and let's help Dad not to be so defensive. She goes, okay. So about a week later, I'm saying prayers with Allison, and Allison says, you know, Mom and I were talking, and we think you're doing better. And I said, let's stop and say a prayer right now and thank the Lord for helping me with that. Anything I can pray for you about? Listen, that's the way you keep the communication lines open with your kids. You just be vulnerable, and you periodically, instead of just always correcting them, be open to their feedback about ways that they can help you be a better person. By the way, you want to couple criticism with compliments. I want you to notice this ratio that the Holy Spirit gives us that I think is so interesting. This is about the church at Ephesus. Revelation 2, 1 through 4, God gives them a string of compliments. He says, I know thy toil and thy patience, and that you've not grown weary, but then he gives them a whopper. He says, but nevertheless, I have this against you, you've left your first love. But I want you to notice this atmosphere of affirmation, 3 compliments to 1 criticism. The bitter pill of criticism can be swallowed much easier if first sugar-coated with the medicine of sincere praise. Remember Mary Poppins? A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. Now, how do you receive criticism constructively? Maybe someone comes to you and they're not asking your permission, which most people don't. Maybe you get into some row with someone. How do you handle that like a Christian in a way that's functional? Well, let the first words out of your mouth be thank you. Someone criticizes me, my first tendency is to try to give some defense. The best thing to do instead is just to say, thank you for telling me how you feel. Thank you for giving me feedback. I need that. So, once you say thank you to someone who criticizes you, it kind of takes the wind out of their sails. It's very, very important. Secondly, remember 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 18, in everything give thanks, including when someone's criticizing you. There's lots of reasons to be thankful when someone criticizes you. First of all, they've said it to your face and not behind your back. It's a whole lot easier to talk behind someone's back than it is to their face. Secondly, if it's true, then you need to improve. You need to change. This person has been your friend and helped you to grow. If it's false, some misunderstanding, this gives you an opportunity to correct the misunderstanding. So many times people get offended by something someone has said, they misunderstood what the person meant, and they just think these bad things about this other person without ever talking it through. By the way, I'm convinced that if brethren would follow this principle, would avoid 95% of church splits. But oftentimes brethren just won't do it. They'll talk behind their brother or sister's back, instead of in love coming to them and saying, you know, something's really been bothering me. Is this a good time for us to talk about it? Because I value our relationship and I want to see if we can't get this straightened out. And most of the time you can. This is so important to unity in the home and in the church family. And always ask, what can I learn from the criticism? In the case of Amy, Gail and I thought about it and we decided, you know, let's give Amy some more chores when she comes home from school that's over and above her normal family responsibilities, and let's increase her allowance to make up for that. And it was a real win-win because she took over some of my chores. I like that. And she got some more money, which she was really feeling she wanted. Not all criticism is valid, but you can still learn something from all kinds of criticism and then take action if possible. Well, Brother Hunter, what do you do about the things that won't change? Sometimes you talk to your spouse about some idiosyncrasy or about some problem, and they just continue to leave the whiskers in the sink or whatever it is. Well, 1 Peter 4 and verse 8 says, love covers a multitude of sins. One translation says, love accepts many imperfections. You know, there are times where you just decide, you know, this is kind of the way my spouse is. And as long as you're not dealing with some sin that's going to put their full soul in jeopardy, maybe you ought to just learn to accept that little idiosyncrasy and let it go, just like you want them to do the same for you. Some things you just need to accept, which takes me to the serenity prayer. I'm sure you've heard this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Remember, it is to his glory to pass over a transgression and to seek love. So here's a little refrigerator wisdom. Gail and I had this up on our fridge for many years. Don't mind criticism. If it is not true, disregard it. If it's unfair, keep from irritations. If it's ignorant, smile. If it's justified, learn from it. Before we conclude tonight, I guess this is the teacher in me. I want to do a little review with audience participation. All right? So, when you're having an issue with anyone, your spouse or a roommate or a sibling, where do you focus first? On the other person or on yourself? First, you look in the mirror. What can I do to improve this situation? It's easier to change you than it is another person. Then, once you're going to talk to the other person about this speck that you want to get out of their eye, before you do that, what do? Yes, you get permission. And then once you get permission, you make sure you don't what? Yeah, you don't have a log in your own eye. That's true. But what I was looking for is that you watch to make sure you don't give an overdose. Because you only want to do how many at a time? One at a time and no more than once a week. That's 52. Yes, it is, if you chose every week to criticize. Hopefully you won't have to, but you know, don't ever want to give more than one a week. That's right. That would be 52. All right, now, how do you receive criticism properly? Someone criticizes you, what's the first word out of your mouth? Thank you. And there's lots of reasons why you could say that with sincerity. The easiest and simplest way to drastically improve the atmosphere in someone's home is to limit criticism. It is a potent force that can either push us apart or draw us together. It can be a blessing. It does not have to be a bane. You know, it's fascinating. It's the positives that initially attract us to one another, but it's the negatives when they come up and how we deal with them that determines whether we become stronger together or whether we pull each other apart. And in church relationships, we're told to be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, Ephesians 4 and verse 3. And so you've got closeness here at Pleasant Valley, and you want to make sure you don't inadvertently do things to sever those close bonds. Because the community comes in, and they need to sense there's a special love and closeness here. And I want to be a part of that. It's a great witness for the Lord. So, you've listened well. Thank you so very much. If there's anybody here who's subject to the gospel and would like to ask for prayers or maybe become a Christian, won't you come as together we stand and we sing.